Iran's supreme leader has vowed to carry out a harsh response after twin explosions in the country's south killed over 100 people. There's been no claim of responsibility yet for the blasts, which happened near the grave of former top commander Qassem Soleimani. Several people were also reported wounded in a stampede that followed the blasts in the southeastern city of Kerman. Mourners had gathered for a ceremony to mark 4 years since Soleimani was killed in a U.S. drone strike in Iraq. The EU has condemned the explosions as an act of terror and called for the perpetrators to be brought to justice. And the U.S. has denied having any part and said it had no reason to believe Israel did either.
It's too early, at least for us, to be able to say what might have caused it. But I do want to address some of the irresponsible claims that I have seen circulate and say that, number one, the United States was not involved in any way, and any suggestion to the contrary is ridiculous. And number two, we have no reason to believe that Israel was involved in this explosion.
We can now speak to Kamran Matin. He's a senior lecturer on international politics at the University of Sussex. Welcome back to DW. Now, no one's yet claimed responsibility, and we have heard some say it wasn't them. So what do you think is the most likely option here?
Well, since nobody has actually claimed responsibility, one can only speculate on actors who might have the motive or benefiting from the explosions. In that sense, there are a number of possibilities. One is extremist Sunni groups such as ISIS, who have previously conducted terrorist attacks in Iran. The second possibility, despite denial from United States, is Israel, which, even though in the past has not attacked civilian targets in Iran, but given the situation in the region and also the war in Gaza and tension in Lebanese border, and given that Israel has been trying to convince United States to deal with Iran's nuclear program for many years, some, at least in the war cabinet in Israel, might see a response from Iran as a kind of provocation which would drag United States into the conflict and therefore, deal with Iran. The other possibility is actually the Islamic Republic or factions within the Iranian regime itself. If you look at the Ukrainian airliner, which was shut down a few years ago, shortly following the assassination of Qassem Soleimani, we see that at times when the Iranian state feels vulnerable to external attacks, especially United States, they might have a motive to create a situation in which they seem to be the victim of a terrorist attacks and therefore attract international communities kind of sympathy, or in the way that a response to such an attack would be justified domestically, because obviously Iran entering the war against Israel through Hezbollah or other proxies would bring a lot of devastation to Iran, and therefore the regime has to explain its actions to the domestic audience, to its own social base.
Now, Iran very quickly said this was a terrorist attack coming from Iran's enemies. Why do you think the regime came up with this very, very swift explanation before anything really was known at all?
Well, in fact, the statements have been a bit contradictory. For example, Iran's vice president and interior minister immediately accused Israel of conducting the attack, whereas other officials, such as a member of Iran's parliamentary committee for national security, just used the general term of terrorism. And interestingly, the statement from Iran's supreme leader does not mention Israel or United States by name, although it promises a crushing response. So I think in these contradictory statements, one can see the dilemma faced by Iran, because if the regime actually holds Israel or United States responsible, then it's obliged, given the scale of this massacre, to respond. But a response would lead to a major regional war in which United States will be involved. And if they don't actually respond, then that also it's a problem for them, given the damage which it creates to Iran's kind of deterrence in the region and its image of kind of regional hegemony, which it seeks to kind of secure for itself.
Kamran Matin of the University of Sussex, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's speak now to Simon Mabon. He's a professor of international politics at Lancaster University who researches Iran and Middle East politics. Good to have you on DW. Now, no group has yet claimed responsibility. What do you think is the most likely option here?
Well, it's really difficult to speculate at this point, given how precarious the entire Middle East is. It's easy to list maybe 4 or 5 different groups, because after all, Iran is in a bit of a precarious position with a lot of rivals, a lot of enemies, and there's a lot of groups that would want to commit such heinous acts against the Islamic Republic. But it's also, I think, too early to try and speculate, because speculating could pour fuel onto the fire of an increasingly fraught and precarious Middle East, with conflict in Gaza, blasts in Beirut, now blasts in Iran. It's really quite a sensitive moment.
Iran quickly came out saying this was a terrorist attack coming from Iran's enemies. Why do you think the regime came up with this very swift explanation before very much was even known at all?
Well, it needs to demonstrate that it has some semblance of control, some semblance of order, and key officials were very quick to articulate that this was back to being business as usual, that it was back to being a very safe and secure environment. But in order to do that, it needed to demonstrate that there were suspects, there were probable groups, and the narrative of a terrorist attack perpetrated by external enemies is one that we've seen used by the Islamic Republic countless times over the years, and indeed used by many other states who've endured brutal, violent attacks. And we know, as I said previously, there are a number of groups that have expressed anger, frustration, and violent condemnation against Iran in the past. So that list of possible suspects, that list of groups that might be held responsible for this, is quite long.
Mm-hmm. Just to be clear, and just to give our viewers a sense of what we're talking about here, who are those groups?
So there's 2 different types of groups, I guess. There's the state groups, and they're the obvious. It's Israel and the United States. After all, it was the United States that assassinated Qassem Soleimani 4 years ago. So they're the main sort of obvious external state threats. And then there's lots of other groups that either have roots in Iran and have expressed anger at the socioeconomic frustrations or the treatment of those groups themselves. Or groups that are sort of in the periphery. So we're talking the likes of Islamic State and various offshoots of Islamic State, or disenfranchised Baluchi groups, for example. So again, there's a large number of groups that have been deeply affected by the politics and the philosophy of the Islamic Republic of Iran, leading to widespread anger and frustration that has often erupted in violence over the past few decades.
Do you think there could be any link here to the conflict in Gaza?
Well, that's the easy narrative to make, that there were allegations that Iran was in some way behind the Hamas terrorist attacks. And that was quickly quashed by Israeli and US officials. But the narrative remains. And if that is the case, then it would be easy to see this as some form of retaliation. We know that Israel has committed these types of attacks in Iran. But typically, these have been against regime officials, scientists, or military officials, typically linked to the nuclear program, not usually against civilians. So there is a precedent here. But what I think is really important to remember is, as yet, there is no evidence linking Iran to what happened on October the 7th. And the Israelis have been very clear about that, and the Americans have been clear about it. but yet the historical links, the historical enmity, animosity that has been evident, so very clearly evident in relations, or indeed the rivalry between Israel and Iran, makes it very easy to tell that story and for people to believe it.
Simon Mabon, Professor of International Politics at Lancaster University, thank you so much for your assessment.
Thank you.